My name is Lisa Carter, and I was 38 years old the day I buried my husband. The moment they lowered Peter's casket into the ground, I knew I was standing not just at the end of a marriage, but at the beginning of something darker, something that would cling to me like smoke long after the flowers withered. People think grief is quiet, that it wraps you in a blanket of numbness and silence. But mine was noisy, buzzing, alive with whispers that rose from behind black veils and clasped hands. I could hear them all too clearly, like gnats hovering around my ears, and though no one dared say it directly to my face that morning, the weight of their judgment pressed against me as tangibly as the damp autumn air. I stood in the front row, my son's small hand curled tight around mine, and stared at the polished coffin sinking into the earth. It should have been a moment of reverence, but instead it was a battlefield of glances. His parents, Shirley and Gerald, stood stiffly on the other side of the grave, eyes fixed anywhere but me. They didn't reach for me. They didn't touch my son's shoulder. They didn't even mouth the kind of obligatory condolences people spit out in such settings. No, they stood like marble statues, unmoving, and the gap between us was more than physical. It was years of disapproval, cracks in a family facade that had only grown deeper with Peter's death. When the pastor finished his final prayer, the crowd shuffled toward the reception hall for the wake. That was when I caught the first lash of the whip, not to my face, but close enough to sting. As I passed by the vestibule, I heard Shirley's familiar voice in its carefully cultivated church lady tone, the one that could slice flesh without raising volume. She was speaking to Marlene, a woman from her Bible study group who always dressed as though she were auditioning for the role of pious widow in some bad church play. "I just can't believe it ended this way," Shirley murmured, her hand clutching Marlene's arm for effect. Peter deserved so much better. He gave her everything, and all she ever did was break his heart. She never cared for him the way a wife should. Everyone could see it. My feet froze mid-step. For a moment I thought maybe I had misheard, that my ears had twisted her words under the fog of grief, but then Marlene leaned in and whispered something I couldn't catch, and Shirley nodded with a tragic sigh, as though she were the true widow and I nothing more than the mistress who had wormed her way into his bed. It wasn't the time or place to confront her. My son was watching me too closely, sensing the tautness in my arm, the rigid line of my back. So I kept walking, my eyes fixed straight ahead, though inside me something sharp began to tear. The wake was no comfort. Tables sagged under casseroles and baked goods, the kind of food people offer in place of words, but every bite tasted like ash in my mouth. The air was thick with conversations that died the moment I walked near, voices that picked back up as soon as I passed. I felt like a ghost haunting my own life, invisible but also exposed, stripped bare by the cruel scrutiny of those who believed they knew me. I tried to sit quietly at the far end of the hall, to let my son eat a slice of pound cake and laugh at the stories one of his cousins was telling, but the whispers never stopped. I caught flashes of phrases: "Poor Peter, she never worked, he deserved better." Each word landed like gravel thrown against glass, little impacts threatening to shatter what composure I had left. When Shirley and Gerald finally approached, I expected some semblance of civility, but instead they walked right past me to fuss over my son, patting his head, kissing his cheek, murmuring about how much he reminded them of Peter. They never once looked at me. It was as though I were already erased from their narrative, as though Peter's life and death belonged solely to them. I sat there, hands folded tightly in my lap, smile plastered on my face for the sake of appearances, but inside I was burning. Not just with grief for a man I had loved in ways no one else would ever understand, but with fury at being cast as the villain in a story that wasn't theirs to tell. They wanted a scapegoat. They wanted to sanctify Peter's memory by painting me in shades of betrayal and neglect. And the worst part was, I knew these whispers would not stop at this funeral hall. They would spread, as rumors always do, creeping into every pew, every prayer circle, every corner of the church community that had once been my second home. That night, when the house was quiet and my son finally asleep, I sat in the living room staring at the flickering light of a candle someone had left for me. The room felt cavernous, the silence pressing in from all sides, and I realized something with bone-deep clarity. Peter was gone, but the battle over his life, and over me, had just begun. His parents weren't finished. Not by a long shot. And though I didn't know yet what shape their war would take, I felt the first tremors of it under my feet. I blew out the candle and whispered into the dark, not to Peter, not to God, but to myself, I will not be erased. The first direct blow came less than a week after the funeral, before I had even learned how to sleep in the bed alone. I was standing in the kitchen rinsing dishes when I heard the knock. It wasn't tentative or polite. It was sharp, insistent, the kind of knock meant to announce authority. My son was upstairs, headphones on, and so I dried my hands and opened the door to find Shirley and Gerald on the porch. They didn't wait for an invitation. Shirley stepped across the threshold first, her lips pinched, her perfume thick with lilac and disapproval. Gerald followed, silent but towering in the way he always did, like his very presence was a form of intimidation. I forced myself to ask if they wanted tea, because manners had been drilled into me since childhood, but Shirley waved her hand with a brisk flutter, as though the offer was offensive. "We won't be staying long," she said, and then, without preamble, she delivered the strike. "We need to talk about Peter's life insurance." The words were so bald, so casually cruel, that for a moment I thought I had misheard. But she continued, voice sharp and rehearsed. "You know he would have wanted us taken care of. Family comes first, Lisa, and we've already had medical bills piling up. It's only right that a portion of the money go to us." I stared at her, heart thudding in my throat. "That money is for me and our son. That's what Peter wanted. That's why he named me the beneficiary." Gerald cleared his throat, a low rumble meant to silence me. "You think he would have wanted his parents to struggle while you sit on a pile of cash? You were never good with money, Lisa. Everyone knows it." I felt my hands trembling against my sides, but I clenched them into fists to still them. "You don't get to decide what Peter wanted. The paperwork is clear. This isn't a discussion." Shirley's eyes narrowed, her smile brittle as cracked porcelain. "You can keep hiding behind legalities, but the truth will come out. People will see the kind of woman you really are." And with that, they turned and walked out, leaving the door yawning open behind them, as though the house itself didn't belong to me. That night I couldn't eat. My son noticed my untouched plate, asked if I was okay, and I lied, telling him I was just tired. But inside me the storm was gathering, and I knew their visit was only the opening volley. I didn't have to wait long. Within 2 Sundays, the whispers had sharpened into stories. At church, I could feel the weight of eyes on me as I walked down the aisle. People didn't rush to hug me anymore. They didn't ask how I was holding up. Instead, conversation stalled when I passed, and little clumps of women leaned toward one another with furtive glances in my direction. The stories made their way back to me, carried by the same mouths that had once praised my casseroles at potlucks. Shirley and Gerald were saying I was hoarding Peter's money. They said I had been lazy, that I never cared to work, that I spent my days watching television while Peter carried the family. They said I had stolen from his parents, denying them what was rightfully theirs. The cruelty wasn't just in the lies themselves but in how easily people believed them. It was as if grief had stripped me of credibility, as if losing a husband automatically meant losing my good name. The breaking point, though, wasn't the rumors or the icy stares. It was the night my son came home from youth group, his face pale and tight. He dropped his backpack by the door and stood in the living room without speaking, twisting his hands the way he used to when he was little and afraid to admit he'd broken something. Finally, he said, "Mom, someone told me you stole from Grandma and Grandpa. That you're keeping their money." His voice cracked on the last word, and in that instant my chest split open. I knelt in front of him, gripping his shoulders. "Listen to me," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "That's not true. Not a single part of it. Your father's insurance money was meant for us, for you, for your future. That's what he arranged. I haven't taken anything from your grandparents, and I never would." He looked at me with wide, uncertain eyes, and I could see the battle inside him, the pull between loyalty to me and the weight of the lies being whispered in every corner of his life. "But why would they say it if it wasn't true?" he asked, and that question cut deeper than anything his grandparents had said. I pulled him close, burying my face in his hair, and whispered, because sometimes people need someone to blame. And right now, they've decided that person is me. When he finally went upstairs, I sat alone in the dim living room, my heart aching not just with grief but with rage. It wasn't enough that they had poisoned the church against me. Now they were trying to take my son's trust, to turn him against his own mother. That night, for the first time since Peter's death, I didn't cry out of sorrow. I cried out of fury. My tears were hot, bitter, and as they slid down my cheeks I swore to myself I would not let them win. But what I didn't know yet, what I couldn't have imagined as I sat in that darkened house with fists clenched in my lap, was that the very weapon they were using against me, Peter's sainted memory, was a house of cards. And soon enough, I would find the proof that their pedestal had been built on lies. The first time I opened the drawer in Peter's office, it was with shaking hands and a stomach full of dread. I had been avoiding that room for weeks, walking past the closed door as if it were a tomb, as if by leaving his papers untouched I could freeze him in time. But after what Shirley and Gerald had done, after seeing my son's shaken face, hearing him question whether his own mother was a thief, I knew I couldn't keep pretending. If there was any chance of clearing the fog of lies, it would be hidden somewhere in Peter's world, the world he had kept tucked neatly behind that heavy oak desk. The office smelled faintly of his cologne, the one he wore every Sunday, sandalwood, pepper, and something smoky. The scent hit me like a physical blow, and for a moment I nearly shut the door and fled. But instead I forced myself to sit at the desk, to pull open the top drawer and begin the slow, painful work of sifting through what was left behind. At first it was mundane: receipts, insurance forms, crumpled sticky notes with reminders in Peter's bold handwriting. But buried beneath them, in a folder labeled innocuously, work projects, I found something that made my chest tighten. A printout of text messages, dozens of them, between Peter and a number I didn't recognize. The words weren't explicit, not at first. Can't wait to see you again, here, lunch was amazing, you always make me laugh, there. But then the tone shifted, grew warmer, more intimate. She called him handsome. He called her sweetheart. There were emojis, hearts, winks, the kind of playful images he had never once sent to me. I sat there, staring at the pages, my fingers trembling against the paper. My first thought was denial. Maybe it was innocent, maybe just a young coworker flattering her boss, maybe Peter hadn't meant anything by it. But the further I read, the more the truth gnawed at me. Wish I could sneak away with you this weekend, she had written. And Peter's reply, someday. We'll figure it out. My throat tightened, and I felt the walls of the room pressing closer. All those years I had defended him to his parents, insisting they didn't see the good in him, the loyalty, the commitment. And here, in black and white, was the betrayal they would never need to invent, because it was real. I nearly stopped then. I nearly shoved the papers back in the folder and decided ignorance was kinder than bleeding myself dry with every discovery. But something inside me, something sharp and determined, told me to keep digging. If Peter had been keeping secrets, I needed to know all of them. The second drawer yielded more. Bank statements, neatly filed, each one a snapshot of the life we had shared. But as I flipped through, certain numbers caught my eye. Transfers, large ones, thousands of dollars at a time, funneled not into our joint account but into another account with Gerald Carter's name on it. Month after month, year after year, Peter had been siphoning off money and quietly handing it to his parents. I sank back in the chair, the papers limp in my hands. All those arguments we'd had over bills, over why the savings account never seemed to grow, over why I had to stretch grocery money thinner and thinner, he had been giving it away. Not to me. Not to our son's future. To them. The same people who now painted me as greedy, selfish, money-hungry. A bitter laugh escaped my lips, harsh and ugly in the quiet room. They had been fed by him all along, and now they wanted to devour what little he had left us. I shoved the statements back into the folder, heart pounding, and opened the bottom drawer. That was where I found the final nail, the piece that made the room tilt and the air thin. There were 2 letters. The first, from Peter's boss, written in clipped, formal language. It detailed inappropriate workplace behavior, a warning for his flirtatious conduct with younger employees, a reminder that professional boundaries must be respected. My hands shook so violently I could barely keep reading. The man I had defended, the man whose parents now claimed was some kind of saint undone by my neglect, had been cautioned at work for behavior that bordered on harassment. The second letter was worse. Handwritten, scrawled in Shirley's distinct looping script. It was short, barely half a page, but it might as well have been a dagger. Peter, thank you again for keeping things from Lisa. She would never understand, and it's better this way. We're grateful for everything you've done to make sure the money is safe from her. You're a good son, and we're proud of you. Love, Mom and Dad. My vision blurred as tears filled my eyes, but these weren't the hot, helpless tears of grief. These were tears of fury, of vindication, of something wild and alive clawing up my throat. They had known. They had been in on it all along. Every dollar hidden, every secret kept, every quiet betrayal, it was a family operation. I sat there for what felt like hours, the letters spread before me, the texts and bank transfers like puzzle pieces finally snapping into place. My mind replayed every accusation they had flung at me, lazy, selfish, untrustworthy. Every whisper at church, every icy glance, every poisoned word dropped into my son's ear. And now I knew. I had the truth. It struck me then, with a clarity as sharp as broken glass. I could try to argue with them, to beg the church to see reason, to defend myself with nothing but words. But words were fragile, too easily twisted, too easily drowned out by their sanctimonious voices. No, if I wanted to fight back, really fight back, I would need something stronger. I would need proof. I gathered the papers into neat stacks, sliding each discovery into its own manila folder. My hands had stopped shaking by then. I felt steady, almost eerily calm. For the first time since Peter's death, I wasn't drowning. I was planning. I closed the drawer softly, almost reverently, and turned off the light in the office. As I stood in the doorway, looking back at the shadows stretching across his desk, I whispered to the empty room, "You thought you could bury me. But you buried yourself." And with that, I knew, their whispers wouldn't destroy me. They had handed me the very tools of their undoing. The church was never just a building for me. It had been my anchor, the place where I baked pies for potlucks, where my son memorized verses for youth group, where I held Peter's hand during sermons even when his parents sat stiffly a row ahead of us. That sanctuary had been my second home, my refuge. Now it was their stage, and I was the villain in their drama. No matter what I said, no matter how carefully I spoke, I could see in their faces that the verdict had already been rendered. Words alone would never set me free. So when I stood in Peter's office again, the letters and statements spread across the desk like a map, I realized something vital. If I wanted to survive, if I wanted my son to know the truth, I had to show it, not tell it. And I had to show it in a way that couldn't be denied, twisted, or hidden. I started by sorting. It felt almost ceremonial, like preparing offerings. I laid out manila folders across the desk, labeling each one in black ink. But instead of neutral names, I gave them titles, words that carried weight in that church, words that everyone there held up as the foundation of their faith. Faithfulness. Stewardship. Honesty. The irony wasn't lost on me. I almost laughed as I wrote them, the pen carving sharp lines into the paper. Those people preached those virtues every Sunday, sang them in hymns, recited them in prayers, yet here I was about to show them how hollow their saints had really been. I began with faithfulness. Into that folder went the printouts of Peter's texts with the young co-worker, highlighted in yellow where his words betrayed vows he had stood before God and sworn to keep. Wish I could sneak away with you this weekend. Someday. We'll figure it out. Evidence so plain it didn't need commentary. Next was stewardship. That one nearly overflowed. Page after page of bank transfers, thousands of dollars funneled out of our family's pocket and into Shirley and Gerald's. I highlighted the dates, the amounts, the account numbers. A trail of quiet theft masked as family duty. Each transfer spoke louder than any accusation I could make. Finally, honesty. That folder began with the letter from Peter's boss, its stiff language revealing the cracks in the image of the upstanding husband and father his parents worshipped. And right after it, I placed Shirley's handwritten note, the piece de resistance, thanking Peter for keeping things hidden from me, praising him for protecting the money from his own wife. I made copies, just in case. When I was finished, I stepped back and looked at the folders lined neatly on the desk. They seemed almost holy in their order, each one a sermon of its own, each one humming with the weight of truth. I could already imagine the faces of the church ladies when they opened them, the gasps, the shuffling of feet, the quick dart of eyes toward Shirley and Gerald. The question was not if I would use them, but how. I couldn't just hand them to the pastor and hope he would defend me. Pastors like him wanted harmony, wanted conflict smoothed over with prayer and forgiveness. He would have told me to let it go, to rise above. No, I needed a stage as large as theirs, a moment they couldn't spin, couldn't shut down, couldn't bury under scripture and smiles. The answer came to me one night as I lay awake staring at the ceiling fan turning above me. Sunday service. The refreshment table. After church, everyone gathered there. They lingered over coffee and pastries, rifled through bulletins, gossiped in clusters. That was where reputations were cemented and destroyed. That was where Shirley liked to hold court, her hand resting lightly on Marlene's arm as she delivered some new tidbit of poisoned wisdom. If I placed the folders there, on that sacred little island of cookies and caffeine, no one could miss them. And once one curious soul opened the first page, the wildfire would spread. I could already see it in my mind, the whispers reversing, the gasps this time aimed not at me but at them. Shirley and Gerald's carefully curated image crumbling in real time. The more I thought about it, the calmer I became. Not gleeful, not manic, but steady, as if this plan had always been waiting for me, tucked inside the same quiet corner of myself where survival lived. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to argue. All I needed to do was place the truth in their hands and let it speak. Over the next week, I refined everything. I reprinted the texts, the bank statements, the letters, making sure the copies were clear, the highlights crisp. I typed short cover sheets for each folder, not explanations, just the virtue title written in bold at the top, nothing more. The first page in each folder carried the sharpest proof, the kind of evidence that would freeze a reader before they even turned the page. One night, as I sat on the floor surrounded by papers, my son padded into the office, rubbing his eyes. He looked at the piles, at the folders, at me with a question in his gaze he didn't dare voice. "Is this about Dad?" he finally asked. I paused, then nodded. Yes. About the truth of who he was. And about the lies people are telling. His lips pressed together, his jaw tight. Are they going to stop? I hesitated. Not on their own. But I'm going to make sure they can't hurt us anymore. He studied me for a long moment, then gave the smallest nod, as if some part of him understood this wasn't just about revenge, it was about survival. He didn't ask more, and I didn't explain. Some things a mother shields her child from, even as she arms herself. By Saturday night, everything was ready. The folders were stacked neatly in my bag, labeled in thick black letters. I went to bed early but didn't sleep much, lying awake with the hum of anticipation coursing through me. It wasn't nerves, not exactly. It was more like the stillness before a storm, when the air thickens and the trees brace themselves. When the dawn came, pale light slipping through the blinds, I rose with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. I dressed simply, black skirt, plain blouse, hair pulled back. No armor, no theatrics. Just a woman carrying truth in her hands. And as I picked up the bag, I whispered into the silence of the house, let them whisper today. Tomorrow, they'll choke on it. The church parking lot was already half full when I arrived that Sunday morning. The sun had barely crested over the trees, casting long shadows across the asphalt, and the air had that crisp bite of early autumn. I sat in my car for a long moment, fingers gripping the steering wheel, my bag of folders resting like a weight on the passenger seat. For weeks I had been drowning in their lies. Today I was going to let them drown in the truth. I could feel the tremor in my chest, that mixture of nerves and steel that comes when you're standing on the edge of something irreversible. Once I stepped out of the car and carried those folders inside, there would be no undoing it. No quiet retreat, no second chances. Whatever followed would ripple through every pew, every Bible study, every potluck for years to come. But as I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror, hair neat, blouse pressed, eyes sharper than they had been in months, I realized I wasn't afraid. I was ready. I slipped the bag over my shoulder, stepped out of the car, and walked toward the fellowship hall doors. The building looked the same as it always had: white siding, neat flower beds maintained by the ladies' auxiliary, the steeple rising above as though it pointed to something purer than the mess that lived inside. But that morning, to me, it was an arena. The hall was quiet when I entered. A few volunteers were bustling around setting out platters of muffins and plates of cookies, the smell of percolating coffee already filling the air. They barely glanced at me, too busy arranging napkins and sugar packets. Good. That was what I wanted, to slip in unnoticed, invisible until I no longer could be. The refreshment table stretched along the far wall, covered in a white cloth, dotted with pastries and paper cups. I set my bag down at the end, unzipped it slowly, and pulled out the folders. One by one, I placed them in a neat stack right next to the coffee urn, angled just enough so the black lettering on each cover was impossible to miss. Faithfulness. Stewardship. Honesty. The words glared up from the table, bold and unyielding. They looked almost like sermon notes, the kind of thing someone might assume the pastor had left for a Sunday school lesson. Only these sermons carried proof that could break a reputation in half. I straightened the corners of the folders, lined them up just so, and stepped back. My heart thudded, but my hands were steady. This was no longer a plan. It was action. I took my place in the sanctuary long before most others arrived, slipping into a seat near the back. It was the perfect vantage point, close enough to see everything, far enough to remain unnoticed. From there I watched the congregation trickle in, the Andersons with their 4 children, Marlene with her stiff smile and sharper tongue, the choir director bustling with sheet music. And, of course, Shirley and Gerald, gliding down the aisle like royalty, their heads held high as if the church belonged to them. They didn't notice me, or if they did, they didn't acknowledge it. I let my eyes drift back to the refreshment hall door, knowing what sat waiting beyond it. The service itself passed in a haze. Hymns rose and fell, the pastor preached about forgiveness and truth, but my mind wasn't on his words. My pulse beat in my ears with every passing minute, my anticipation building as I pictured the moment the first curious hand would flip open a folder. I kept glancing at my son. He sat beside me, restless, shifting in his seat, but he didn't ask questions. He knew enough to sense that something was about to shift, though I hadn't told him exactly what. I squeezed his hand once, reassuring, and he leaned against me with a trust that only deepened my resolve. When the final amen echoed through the sanctuary, the congregation rose and spilled toward the hall. The usual buzz filled the air, plans for lunch, chatter about football games, murmurs of sympathy still drifting toward my in-laws. I followed slowly, deliberately, hanging back as the crowd pressed forward. The refreshment table was already surrounded when I stepped into the hall. People poured cups of coffee, grabbed cookies, laughed in clusters. And then I saw it, a woman, one of the choir sopranos, picked up the folder marked faithfulness. She frowned, curious, and flipped it open. Her gasp was audible even from where I stood. She clapped a hand over her mouth, eyes wide, and turned the page as if she couldn't help herself. The man beside her leaned in, brows knitting, and soon his eyes shot to Gerald across the room. Another woman reached for stewardship. She flipped through the highlighted bank transfers, her lips moving silently as she read the amounts. By the 3rd page, her cheeks flushed red, and she whispered something sharp to the man next to her. The wildfire had begun. I slipped into a chair at the very back of the hall, hands folded in my lap, and watched as folder after folder was opened, gasps rippling outward, whispers escalating into pointed stares. I didn't need to move. I didn't need to speak. The truth was walking through that room without me, loud enough to silence every lie. And Shirley hadn't even noticed yet. She was at the far end of the table, pouring coffee for Marlene, smiling that brittle smile of hers, oblivious to the storm gathering only a few feet away. I almost pitied her in that moment. Almost. Because soon, very soon, she would feel what it was like to be the one whispered about, the one judged, the one exposed in front of the people she had spent her whole life impressing. I leaned back in my chair, heart steady, and thought, let it happen. Let them finally see. It started with murmurs, faint at first, like the rustle of wind in the trees, but soon the sound thickened, sharp enough to slice through the chatter in the fellowship hall. I watched from the back as heads turned, eyes darted, lips pressed into thin lines. The sopranos who had opened faithfulness were whispering so urgently their coffee went cold in their hands. The men who had leafed through stewardship had stopped pretending to be discreet, their eyes locked on Gerald, brows furrowed in disbelief. And then, as if on cue, someone gasped loud enough to silence half the room. The woman holding honesty had reached the letter in Shirley's looping script. Her hand trembled as she read aloud, unable to contain herself. Thank you for keeping things from Lisa, grateful for everything you've done, safe from her. The words trailed off as the weight of them sank in. All at once, the air shifted. The whispers became accusations, not against me this time, but against the very people who had sharpened their knives on my back. Is this real? A man demanded, holding up the folder of bank transfers like it was a holy text. Gerald, did Peter really funnel all this money to you? Shirley froze. The coffee pot in her hand tilted, spilling a dark stream across the tablecloth, but she didn't even notice. Her eyes flicked to Gerald, then to the open folders scattered across the table, then to the growing circle of faces turned toward her. Of course it's not real, she snapped, her voice higher than usual, brittle as cracked glass. Anyone could have put those together. Lies. Vicious lies meant to. But she didn't finish. Because just then Marlene, her closest ally, snatched one of the folders from the table and began flipping through. Her face drained of color as she reached the text messages, her lips moving silently as she read the words Peter had written to another woman. Slowly, she looked up at Shirley, betrayal written across her features. He wasn't faithful to Lisa, or to you, she whispered, her voice breaking. All this time, you let us think. That was the moment the wildfire became an inferno. People pressed closer, grabbing pages, holding them up for others to see. Look at this, someone hissed, shoving the boss's letter into a friend's hand. He was warned for inappropriate behavior at work. Thousands of dollars, another man muttered, stabbing a finger at the bank statements. Thousands, every month, straight into their account. I sat perfectly still, watching as the same congregation that had once turned its back on me now turned its fury on them. The room pulsed with energy, hot and electric, voices rising over one another, the once polite church hall now a storm of outrage. Shirley's face was flushed crimson, her lips trembling as she tried to regain her composure. These are fabrications, she insisted, louder this time, as though volume could rewrite facts. You all know Peter. He was a good man. He loved his family. But no one was listening anymore. The words had been read, the evidence seen. And once truth settles in, it cannot be undone by protest. Gerald finally spoke, his voice deep and defensive. Peter wanted to help us. That was his choice. We never asked him to hide anything. But even as he said it, someone held up the letter in Shirley's handwriting, waving it in the air like a banner. Better this way. Safe from her. Is that your idea of not asking? The hall erupted again, gasps mixing with condemnation, voices layering one over another. The tension grew so thick I half expected the ceiling beams to crack. It was then that the pastor stepped in, his voice booming in a futile attempt to regain order. Brothers and sisters, please, let us not give in to gossip. Let us. But even he faltered when someone thrust the folder into his hands. He glanced at the pages, his eyes scanning the texts, the transfers, the letters. I watched his face change, disbelief, then discomfort, then something closer to resignation. When he looked up, his gaze landed on Shirley and Gerald, and for the first time I saw it, doubt. He tried to smooth it over, of course. Now, we must remember that none of us are perfect, and the Lord calls us to forgiveness. But the congregation wasn't listening. They weren't interested in forgiveness. They had been fed a lie for weeks, turned against me with sanctimonious fervor, and now they realized they had been used. Their indignation had no outlet but the one standing red-faced near the refreshment table. Marlene was the first to speak up directly, her voice sharp as a blade. You told me Lisa was selfish. That she didn't care for Peter. And all along, you were hiding this? How dare you? Others chimed in, the accusations flowing now not in whispers but in clear, cutting tones. You slandered her. You made us believe she was hoarding money. And all this time, you were the ones taking it. Shirley's composure finally cracked. Her lips twisted, her voice shrill. She planted this. Don't you see? She's been waiting to destroy us. And for the first time, every pair of eyes in that room turned not to me, but away from her. No one believed her anymore. I sat in the back, hands folded neatly in my lap, my face calm though inside my pulse raced with a quiet, steady triumph. I didn't need to stand or raise my voice. My work was already done. The evidence spoke louder than I ever could, louder than all their weeks of lies. The pastor tried again, urging people to lower their voices, to take a breath, but the damage was complete. The truth had been spilled across the fellowship hall like broken glass, and no one could step around it without being cut. Shirley and Gerald stood there, cornered by their own words, their own greed, their own complicity. And for the first time since Peter's death, I saw fear in their eyes. Not grief. Not sanctimony. Fear. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly. After weeks of whispers, the tables had turned. Now it was their turn to be judged, and no amount of piety could shield them. And I thought to myself, this is what justice feels like. Not loud. Not violent. Just undeniable. I will never forget the sight of Shirley and Gerald standing in that fellowship hall, back straight but faces crumbling, their authority slipping through their fingers like sand. For years they had walked through those doors as if they owned the place, as if the church were an extension of their living room, every pew a throne, every member their audience. But that morning, stripped bare by the truth, they looked small, not regal, not untouchable, just two people caught red-handed in their own hypocrisy. The questions came first. Direct, relentless, impossible to dodge. Gerald, how much money did Peter give you? One of the deacons demanded, his voice edged with fury. Did you know about the co-worker? A woman asked, clutching the faithfulness folder like it was burning her hands. Shirley, how could you stand there week after week accusing Lisa when you were hiding this? Another spat. For once, their practiced responses, the dismissive tones, the patronizing sighs, failed them. Shirley's face was blotchy, her eyes darting like a trapped animal. Gerald tried to steady the moment with his usual deep-voiced authority, but even he couldn't mask the tremor in his words. Peter was our son. He wanted to help us. You can't blame us for accepting what he chose to give. But the crowd wasn't buying it. They weren't interested in excuses. They wanted accountability. They wanted answers. And Shirley, who had always thrived under scrutiny when she was the one holding the magnifying glass, now wilted under its glare. I never lied, she insisted, her voice cracking. I only told you what I believed. Believed? Marlene interrupted, her voice like a whip. She held up the letter in Shirley's handwriting, shaking it in the air. This is your hand. These are your words. Safe from her. You believed in hiding money from your own daughter-in-law, and then you slandered her to us? You poisoned this church. The hall fell into a heavy silence after that, the weight of Marlene's accusation pressing down on every head. For once, Shirley had no reply. Her mouth opened, then closed, then opened again, but no words came. It was the pastor who finally broke the quiet, his voice low and solemn. "Shirley, Gerald. I think it would be best if you step down from leading the Bible study. At least until trust can be rebuilt." The sentence hit like a hammer. Their Bible study group had been their kingdom, their place of authority, their weekly stage for spreading piety and gossip. To have it stripped away, publicly and decisively, was a wound deeper than any scolding. I saw it in the way Shirley's chin wobbled, the way Gerald's jaw clenched. But worse was the congregation's reaction. People began to turn their backs, literally turning away from them. Clusters of friends who once leaned in to hear Shirley's every word now shifted, distancing themselves, refusing eye contact. The social circle that had once been their armor disintegrated before my eyes. My son sat beside me, wide-eyed, watching it unfold. I reached for his hand under the table, squeezed it gently, and when he looked at me I gave the smallest nod. This wasn't revenge for revenge's sake anymore. This was truth reclaiming its place. Eventually, Shirley and Gerald could no longer endure it. They stood stiffly, their faces frozen in brittle dignity, and walked out of the fellowship hall without a word. The room parted for them like the Red Sea, but this time there was no reverence in the gesture, only rejection. People averted their eyes, folded their arms, whispered not with admiration but disgust. The doors closed behind them with a dull thud. In the silence that followed, someone, I never saw who, said quietly, "Lisa, I'm so sorry." And then the flood came. One by one, people approached me. Some placed hands on my shoulder, some spoke words of apology, some simply bowed their heads in shame. They admitted they had believed the lies. They admitted they had judged me. And though a part of me wanted to spit their words back at them, to remind them how easily they had turned, I stayed quiet. I let them carry their own guilt. Their contrition wasn't for me to absolve, it was theirs to bear. That night, word spread fast. By Monday morning, Shirley and Gerald had vanished from every church function, their names whispered with pity rather than respect. Their kingdom was gone. The phone calls, the invitations, the pedestal, all gone. And for the first time since Peter's death, the house felt lighter. Still, I knew better than to assume they were finished. Pride doesn't die quietly. But pride also doesn't survive without an audience, and theirs had abandoned them. They were left with each other, two fallen monarchs clinging to the ruins of their throne. I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. I simply sat in my son's room that night as he did his homework, listening to the scratch of his pencil, the sound of him humming under his breath. He looked up once, catching me staring, and smiled shyly. "I'm glad people know the truth now," he said. "I knew you wouldn't lie to me." In that moment, everything was worth it. The whispers were over. The lies were silenced. The truth had spoken. And Shirley and Gerald had been left to choke on their own poison. The following Sunday, I almost didn't go to church. The thought of walking back into that sanctuary, of seeing faces that had so recently turned cold toward me, made my stomach knot. But my son insisted. "We always go," he said quietly, setting out his dress shoes by the door. There was no defiance in his voice, just a steady faith that we belonged there, and I realized he was right. Avoiding that place would mean they had still won something. So we went. The air felt different the moment we stepped inside. People greeted me, some with cautious smiles, others with hugs that lingered too long, as though they could squeeze out the shame of having believed lies about me. I nodded, accepted their apologies when they came, though I didn't absolve them. Their contrition wasn't a gift for me, it was a burden they had to carry. But I let them say the words, let them try to undo the damage, because I knew that in their own way, they needed it as much as I did. The service itself was quieter, stripped of the usual cheer. The pastor's sermon leaned heavily on themes of honesty, accountability, and the danger of false witness. His eyes skimmed across the pews, avoiding mine, landing instead on the empty spot where Shirley and Gerald once sat in their usual seats, front and center. The absence was loud. Afterward, people pressed around me again. One woman, the same soprano who had opened Faithfulness, clutched my hand with tears in her eyes. I judged you, she admitted. I said things about you that I had no right to say. I see now how wrong I was. Please forgive me. I met her gaze steadily. I don't need to forgive you. The truth already did that. She blinked at me, startled, but then nodded, as if she understood. All through the hall, it was the same. Apologies, explanations, people trying to patch over the cracks they had helped create. I accepted their words with a calm face, but inside I knew something fundamental had shifted. I would never again give these people the power to define me. They had proven too easily swayed, too eager to believe the worst. I could coexist with them, even smile among them, but I would never again hand them my trust. The only opinion that mattered sat beside me at our small kitchen table that night. My son pushed his plate aside, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and said, almost casually, "I'm proud of you, Mom." The word stunned me more than anything Shirley had ever said. I looked at him, at his tired eyes that had seen too much for his age, at the small smile pulling at the corners of his mouth. "Why?" I asked softly. "Because you didn't let them win," he said. "Because you showed everyone the truth. And because you didn't hide it from me." He hesitated, then added, "I was scared for a while. I didn't know what to believe. But now I know. And I'm glad you fought back." I reached across the table, took his hand in mine, and felt the last piece of my resolve click into place. This hadn't just been about revenge. It had been about survival. About protecting him. About showing him that silence is surrender, and that sometimes the only way to fight lies is to drag the truth into the light and let it burn. Later that week, I returned to Peter's office one final time. The folders were gone, the evidence dispersed into the hands of people who would never forget it. What remained was the desk, the drawers, the smell of cologne still clinging faintly to the curtains. I opened the bottom drawer, touched the empty space where the letters had been, and then closed it with deliberate finality. I didn't need to keep them anymore. I didn't need to revisit the betrayal, the lies, the proof. The church had seen it, my son had understood it, and Shirley and Gerald had been undone by it. The file cabinet could stay closed forever. I stood in the doorway, looked at the desk bathed in the dim afternoon light, and whispered, "It's over." And for the first time since Peter's death, I meant it. I didn't need revenge anymore. I didn't need apologies or explanations. I had already won, not by destroying them, but by refusing to let them destroy me. When I turned off the light and shut the office door behind me, it wasn't grief I felt pressing against my chest. It was something quieter, steadier, almost foreign after months of chaos. It was peace. And that's where it ended for me. No more whispers, no more lies, no more battles left to fight. If you stuck with me through the whole story, thank you. I'd love to know what you think. Did I go too far, or not far enough? Have you ever had family turn on you like this? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because I'm curious how you would have handled it. And hey, if you want to hear more raw, real revenge stories like this, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. Because trust me, I've got more.